HarperCollins for this. And thank you all for coming on a weekday evening, braving Pune's worsening traffic. Not as worse as Bangalore, where Ram stays, but still bad. Congrats, Ram, for this book. It's incredible how prolific you are. I can't keep track. It's impossible. How do you write so much that I can't possibly even read that much?
Well, I'll answer that question. First of all, thanks, Ashish, for agreeing to do this. Thank you all for coming. I see people whom I've never met before. I'm happy to meet them today. Old friends, old mentors. Above all, Ashish, whom I've known for a mere matter of 41 years and counting. He was an undergraduate. I was a graduate student when we first met. You know, that's a question that's sometimes asked to me. And the answer is, there's either a four-word answer or a one-word answer. The four-word answer is, I live in Bengaluru. The one-word answer is Bengaluru. And and of course, if you want a more expansive interpretation of how that helps someone like me practice his vocation, it's very far away from Delhi. It has a gorgeous climate. I have quoted this line before, but I like quoting it. Whenever questions like this come, it's a line attributed to C.V. Raman, who studied in Chennai, Madras, worked in Calcutta, of course came from deepest Tamil Nadu and settled in Bangalore. And he once said, "My greatest discovery is the weather of Bangalore." So I think these are some of the reasons why one can work there. And it's no accident that India's finest scientific research institutes, like Indian Institute of Science and the National Center for Biological Sciences, are also in Bangalore. So I think that's the city needs. And the other attributes to the city, it has it's a welcoming, tolerant place. It discriminates less according to lines of caste, religion, and gender. It does discriminate, but it somewhat less than other parts of India, language and so on. Yeah.
I think I'm beginning to see the beginnings of another book, maybe on Bangalore. Thanks, yeah. No, so I think I read the book, and I have to tell you that I loved it. I think the pacing is very good, the flow is good, the connections between the chapters, the 10 people who you sort of write about, the clarity. So all of that I really liked, and it's kind of compelling reading, because even for somebody like me who's been 45 years in the environmental field, there was so much in this which I didn't even know. Things like Patrick Geddes and his town planning and a lot more. So fantastic for that. So congratulations again. I have a few questions, and maybe towards the latter part, some sort of some grilling also, if you're okay with that. So I think Ram was actually in the Kalpurik's office this morning, and we were remembering that we met back in 1983 when he had written an article, EPW I think, on the myth that environmental issues can only be taken up by the elite or in rich countries or by the rich. And so we had actually had two of us as school kids and college, we kind of had a sitting with him. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, some of the same motivation is behind the writing of this book. But tell us more about why you've written this.
Guys, that article of mine, which is not very widely read anymore, it was a review essay of a book on Western environmentalism. It was published in the Economic and Political Weekly, and it was called Ecological Crises and Ecological Movements. It was a review article, a bourgeois deviation ? And that last question, the subtitle, a bourgeois deviation ? arose from the fact that I did a PhD in Kolkata. And for the young people in this room, the 1980s, are like ancient prehistory, because the Berlin Wall was very much in existence. Calcutta was ruled by the CPM. And my teachers in Calcutta were Marxists. All of them were Marxists. There were different kinds of Marxists. They were, Trotskyists, Leninists, Maoists, pro-Soviet Marxists, pro-Cuban Marxists, pro-Vietnam Marxists. They were all Marxists. And they also, when I started my research on the history of the Chipko movement, which was an environmentalism of the poor, a grassroots movement, which also I know deeply inspired you in your work, they said, but it's a bourgeois deviation. And I'll tell a story which I've never told in print before, which will interest several people here. I mean, you and Madhav particularly, but many others. So the Chipko movement, so I was explaining to two Marxist friends, very old friends of mine, who had actually been undergraduate students with me. I was explaining to them what the Chipko movement is about. I was saying they're these peasants, they depend on forests and pasture and for their subsistence, and their resources were taken over by, those forests were given by the state to plywood and paper factories in the plains. And that meant a deprivation of their livelihood, but also environmental degradation, because when you change the species composition and things that all of you are now familiar with. So I was explaining to these two friends of mine, I said, wait a minute. Those forests are being cut for the plywood and paper factories in Saharanpur and Bareilly and Lucknow. I said, yes, he said. But then these people who are studying these villages of the Chipko movement, they are reactionary. They are objectively against the revolution. I said, what do you mean? He said, the forests that they are wanting to save, if they are being commercially exploited, they are creating the industrial proletariat that will be the vanguard of the revolution. So screw their dispossession, screw the environmental degradation. Did you understand? It's a bourgeois, it's a deviation. So that's how my work started. And then, of course, after I finished my PhD, I happened to go to America for a postdoc, where there was the skepticism was of a different kind, where the argument was that you had to be a wealthy country where most of your material needs were fulfilled to be concerned about protecting nature for aesthetic and other reasons, aesthetic or environmental reasons. So those of us who had, in different ways, I mean, it's inevitable with Professor Madhav Gadgil that he will, figure occasionally in the conversation. But the Chipko movement, which occurred 51 years ago, 52 years ago, was fundamental in shaping Ashish's environmentalism, Ashish Kothari's environmentalism, Madhav Gadgil's ecological research, my sociological research, the formation of the Center for Science and Environment, and dozens of other people. I mean, so I think so in a sense, Chipko played a major role in the books and the papers I was to write in the 80s and 90s on how, in a country like India, because of high population densities, more fragile tropical ecologies, and the fact that we didn't have access to colonies, our path of development actually had to be much more environmentally responsible than it was. Right? And that's the kind of work you did and many others did and continue. What this book does is take that argument 100 years back and show that there's a forgotten prehistory of Chipko. We kind of assumed that Chipko catalyzed the debate. And Chipko, again, the significance of Chipko cannot be overestimated, because it was women, men, and teenage children in Garhwal and Kumaon who not only began Indian environmentalism, it inspired scientists, journalists, activists, lawyers, sociologists, historians to look at these things critically. So we all saw it as a kind of foundational event. It was kind of an origin myth. So वहीं से सब शुरू हुआ. And that was partly true, but my book shows that there was a distant prehistory, which from the 19th century. And so yes, so in a sense it is, I suppose you could say, there's an arc in my research in environmentalism. It begins with the Unquiet Woods and carries on with the work I did with Madhav and now ends with this.
Okay. No, that's very interesting. And I'm going to come back to this in terms of the history of environmentalism itself in a bit. But before that, I think, so the 10 people that you featured here, from the readings, this is what I gleaned from it. Just sort of in terms of key issues. Okay, Tagore in terms of the transformation of education from a nature sort of perspective. Kumarappa, transformation of the economy. The Howards, agriculture and not the Green Revolution, but sustainable organic farming kind of thing. Mukherjee on research and knowledge, interdisciplinarity kind of thing. Miraben on the commons and community-driven actions. Elwin on Adivasis and the commons. Geddes on the transformation of urban planning. Very interesting chapter, by the way. I had no idea about that. Krishnan on all of nature, not just megafauna, which was India's sort of wildlife conservation kind of thing. So if you think of these 10 people, what are the what's a thread that's running through all of these?
No, you, I think, put it very well. I mean, you put it better than I have, to show the the distinctive originality of each of them. That, how they were original in their approach in different spheres, in different ecological and social spheres. The commonality is that, that's why the subtitle is the origin. There are two things that bind them together. Though they work in different spheres, different time periods, they have had different personal geographies, they focus on different resources, different landscapes, different communities. There are two things I think that bring them together. One is that they were environmentalists before the term environmentalist was coined. Okay, they didn't. Today we see them as environmentalists, just as shall we say, since I'm speaking in Pune, if those of you who are familiar with the work of, say, Tarabai Shinde. Okay, now, she was a feminist before feminism was thought of, or that, okay, right. So, in a sense, that is one thing that is common to them. The second thing is that with the exception of Krishnan, they were all, speaking with nature, not speaking for nature. Krishnan was an extraordinary figure, and I yield to no one in my admiration for his powers of observation and description of the natural world, and also for his literary qualities. He was a superb writer. In fact, I don't know whether you noticed this, Ashish, but the book starts with Rabindranath Tagore and ends with M. Krishnan, much less known than Rabindranath Tagore outside the environmental sphere, extraordinary Madras naturalist and writer. And that chapter quotes Ashish, a correspondence that you had with Krishnan when you were a very young man. So, but he was sort of speaking with nature. He was a spokesperson for nature. He was speaking for the non-human world. Whereas the others were looking at some kind of interaction, symbiosis, reciprocity. So they were speaking with nature. So that's why I think these are possible. But they were very diverse, and as you point out. And I think that's in some ways, I hope, the appeal of the book. Now, you just said that you found the chapter on Patrick Geddes particularly interesting. Now, I recently talked to a very urban historian and town planner who knew all about Geddes but knew nothing about Kumarappa and Mirabai and Howard. So he said that was very interesting. Right? So your chapter on Geddes, maybe I learned a little bit, but kind of I knew most of what he did. So I think the fact is this diversity of characters. And I think but all united by this an early sort of incipient, prescient environmentalism, and also marrying environmental sustainability to what social justice and community rights. I think that's broadly what, but they are very diverse lives. And like I said, I expect this book to be read differently by different people given their own backgrounds.
So just one further thought on that. So marrying or putting together environment and social justice is obviously absolutely important in a country, anywhere, but especially in a country like India. I was a little puzzled though with your choice of K.M. Munshi. Because you think of, and you yourself have called him the first Hindutva environmentalist. Now, his Hindutva trend didn't seem particularly social justice kind to me. But no, sorry, an additional point there, that he pushed the Van Mahotsav. He introduced it, he pushed that. Now, there's this whole thing that environment is about trees and forests. We only have a forest department. We don't have a grassland department or a wetland department kind of thing. This comes from the British times, right? So, to my mind, both ecologically and socially, a bit of a misfit, I think. So what's your...
No, I think it's interesting because he appears to be a misfit. But there was a period when he was promoting a marriage between Hindu spirituality and environmentalism. And I think that is now a trend. You will see it so in a sense, he is also a pioneer in that he's anticipating what some Hindutva ideologues today will tell you. That we Hindus always cared for nature. There are these verses in the Veda. Look at Kalidas's poetry and his description of the landscape. And of course, that doesn't stop a professedly Hindu first party from ravaging the Himalaya with his roads and dams. And that's a separate question. But philosophically, they'll tell you that. So he is also a pioneer of a trend that is now, even if you and I may have a shared distaste for it, as a scholar, I have to suppress that distaste and look at its influence. That today there is a kind of it's not just Hinduism. As you know from your travels overseas, you will find people promoting a Buddhist environmentalism, a Christian environmentalism, and so on. So, and the other interesting thing about why I was pretty, keen to include Munshi Munshi and Tagore are the two people in this book who are incredibly celebrated for their contributions in other spheres. And Tagore's love of nature is dimly known, but not his multifaceted environmentalism, which I show. But Munshi, the people who, they know him because of Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, because of his novels which portray, those of you who are from Gujarat know the kind of worldview that Munshi's novels have promoted. He was a terrifically successful lawyer. He was important member of the Constituent Assembly. He was representing the Indian government in Hyderabad when the police action took place. So he's a fascinating character. But those few years when he was Minister of Food and Agriculture promoting Vana Mahotsava, even the most fervent admirers of Munshi don't know about. So I was, as a historian, that attracted me, bringing out this forgotten part of Munshi's life.
Got it. Now, so you have on the
but
cover...
I'll say one thing.
Huh.
So the last chapter, right at the end, there's an epilogue, which is called a partially usable past question mark. So after all the work of these 10 people is described. So there's a chapter which talks about in what ways do each of these pioneers speak to the present? From Tagore, sort of like what you said in your introduction remarks. From Tagore, the importance of environmental education. From Kumarappa, the integration of economic self-sufficiency, village level environment, sustainability, Muiraba and the commons. And so it outlines all of these. And Munshi is not mentioned. So my editor at HarperCollins said, you say these, but you've not mentioned one. I said it's deliberate. 9 of them, I think, are both of historical and contemporary interest. One is merely of antiquated interest. So it's, but I didn't say. He pointed out that why is Munshi not there? Because I kind of revealed my cards as to.
So the absence is speaking to us. I think that makes sense. The cover of the book has Gandhi.
Yeah,
and to me, that's obvious. Yes, of course, Tagore. But that's an obvious and I'm sure deliberate omission. So how come Gandhi is not here?
So there's again, it is a deliberate omission for 2 reasons. One is I have already published a very large 2-volume biography of Gandhi. 3 reasons. One is I published a 2-volume biography of Gandhi. I've had my say. A second is that there are 2 direct disciples of Gandhi in this book, Meera and Kumarappa. So who fleshed out his environmental ideas in a more thorough and systematic way than he could do himself. And thirdly, I may at some stage write separately about Gandhi's environmentalism. But this cover is Gandhi and Tagore and in Shantiniketan, under a tree, speaking with nature, on Gandhi's last visit to Shantiniketan about a year before Tagore died. It's really historically a very important photograph.
It's very moving picture, this one. So actually also in terms of Gandhi is one, but I was also thinking of, did you think of, let's say, and you've written about him, Shankar Guha Niyogi, because when you talk about environmentalism, the poor, he was the first and possibly the only major trade union leader to try and put trade union, workers' rights and environment together. He has this fantastic essay, right, it's called Our Environment, in which he talks about why the peacock no longer dances. So he was working in Chhattisgarh with all the mining and industrialization and all the deforestation. And he was talking about how nature is being destroyed and how the peacock no longer dances. So was that a consideration? And you have written about him, of course, earlier.
Since we are, it is there in the article I wrote about him, but for the rest of those of you who have not read the article, let me recall what I said there. But my only time I met Shankar Guha Niyogi. Shankar Guha was an extraordinary trade union activist in Delhi, Hazara in Chhattisgarh, working on unorganized labor. And as Ashish said, marrying workers' rights with health. He started an extraordinary people's hospital where Dr. Binayak Sen and others worked, and with environmental sustainability. And happened to once wake him up from his sleep. He was sleeping in a friend's flat. And I was in search of that friend, and I knocked and he woke up. And it must have been the only, and one of the times I really felt guilty in my life to wake up an extraordinary social activist who was snatching about half an hour of sleep in the afternoon. And the reason, and then of course he was shot dead by some kind of industrialist stroke mining mafia, we don't know, in I think 1991. And the reason he's not there is that this is the pre-Chipko book. And but I hope, and I've said this in one or two talks I've written, in one or two conversations about this present book, and I'll say it again. I think that one of the things I would hope this book to catalyze, it's a history of Indian environmental thinking before Chipko. I hope this book will catalyze, is a history of Indian environmentalism from Chipko onwards, from Chipko till today, which will have thinkers like the Chipko thinkers and Shankar Guha and Mera Patkar and activists. It will have movements. It will have organizations like Kalpraviksh and Center for Science and Environment and ITRI and Center for Ecological Sciences, the role of scientists, of journalists, what transformations in laws took place, the anti-environmental backlash, which is, I think, really something that has to be studied. The kind of attacks on environmentalists by, right-wing columnists and by the state. And so I think but the reason he doesn't figure here is that this is really showcases thinkers from before Chipko.
Got it. But I think, the kind of book you're talking about, I hope somebody from the audience actually picks up that idea, because it's absolutely important. It hasn't been done yet. It needs to be done.
And there's so much material. There'll be stuff all over, with different people, documents, papers, oral histories, newspaper accounts. I think it's a really rich field if people want to study it. Yeah.
Now, in terms of the contemporary relevance of the 10 people that you've sort of featured here, one of the things, there are many things that struck me, but one of the things that struck me was Kumarappa's advice when the states were being reorganized post-independence, that the state should be organized not along linguistic lines, but along the lines of rivers. Okay, so a Narmada state or a Ganga state or whatever. And today, there's a lot of talk about bioregionalism or biocultural regionalism and looking beyond current political boundaries, not just within India, but also, let's say, South Asia, to see, okay, how do we reconnect flows of nature, flows of culture? So, a couple of such ideas that you think today, one is bioregionalism, but if you can just, off the top of your head, think of 3 or 4 such things that you think today are so much more relevant, maybe even than when they wrote.
No, I think something I have not developed in this book, except right in the end, is the idea of political decentralization as a means towards promoting environmental sustainability and social justice. Whether it's how you manage your forests, your waters, how mining is permitted, not permitting. But this is a work of scholarship. It's not a work of advocacy. It may have ideas that people in the field of advocacy and policy can pick up. But I didn't want to, except gently in the epilogue, I didn't want to, shall we say, provide a charter or a manifesto. Just gently I want to nudge people, and it's the detailed chapters themselves, like you picked up on Kumarappa's idea of bioregionalism, that I think, I hope are read in that. But I didn't want to do the handholding, because I'm not competent to do it also.
No, that's fine. But I think, for instance, localization, right? Yeah. Kumarappa's work was all about local self-reliant economies and all that. So I think there's a lot of stuff, nuggets there, which today we should pick up in terms of looking at.
And also, say, for example, Christian's emphasis on what you said, total biological diversity, not just tigers and elephants and rhinoceros.
Yeah. And it was amazing how he wrote about
the unglamorous landscapes of the Deccan and the small species and the wetlands and the birds and plants. Yeah.
And I think his record of 54 years of fortnightly column in the Statesman is still not been broken. Probably never will be. Amazing.
It may even be a world record.
could well be.
And the sheer quality of those columns, And Ashish and I were particularly privileged because this is pre-internet. And he was in Madras, but he was not well known in Madras except among a select few. He was well known among readers of the Statesman in Bengal, but the Statesman also had a Delhi edition, which Ashish read growing up, and I read because it came to Dehradun one day late, dark edition. But he was just I said recently in another talk that I think he was the most gifted writer I ever knew, or ever read, Indian writer. Yeah. And it just so happened that he was working not only before the internet, but also before the age of publishing. So no one could publish his books like this. There were no good commercial publishers who could bring 12 columns and distribute it. And one of the things I'm doing, actually, so I have many of his columns. Okay. I think he may have written 1,600 or 1,800 columns. I have Xeroxes about 800 from which I wrote my chapter. I'm presenting them to the National Center of Biological Sciences archive. So they'll all be there. And hopefully they'll digitize it and you'll see the kind of things he wrote about and how he wrote about it.
Excellent.
Did you ever meet him, by the way?
I did once.
Tell us
We
about
had
it.
some
Where-
correspondence. Well, it was a very short,
Where was it? In
brief
Delhi?
meeting, and when basically I was
In Delhi?
I was kind of awestruck. Yeah,
Ah.
I was anyway awestruck because of his things, but also his photography. I mean,
Yeah.
me being
That
a
would-
bit of a
doesn't it go
photographer,
with
I
you?
was like,
Yeah,
wow, this black and white, the sheer power of the black and white photographs that he used to take. So both the prose and the photographs together was amazing. So let me sort of grill you on a couple of things which I found not uncomfortable, but just want to question you on this. So one is, I think you say something about environmentalist kind of, and right now also in your remarks about Chipko. So we date ourselves back to, say, the Chipko movement as being the beginnings of the modern environmental movement in India. I'm not so sure about that, Ram, because for instance, when I was growing up, and even in some of the work that we were doing, we had Bishnoi, for instance, which is almost 300 years back. We had the Adivasi struggles, we had Gandhi, we had the Kumaon struggles, which you have written about. Some of the early sort of anti-fishing, even some of the anti-dam movements from earlier, right?
Yeah,
including
Senapati Bapat.
exactly,
So, the
Senapati
Munshi
Bapat, right?
Satyagraha.
We're on the road right now, right?
Yeah.
So it seems to me that our heritage actually does go back, and some of us at least were acknowledging that. So I was a little puzzled when you said that mostly environmentalists today are sort of
broadly. I think even the Bishnoi issue was brought back by Chipko. Yeah. It was not inspired by it. Actually, it's a very interesting story. Madhav is here. It was a very interesting story. Chipko had nothing, was not inspired by it. It had nothing to do with the Bishnois. Madhav and K.C. Malhotra were doing fieldwork in Rajasthan, and they interviewed some Bishnois who told this folk story, which they wrote about, and then Sundarlal ji picked it up and said, "वहाँ बहुत पहले भी Chipko movement हुआ था," but Chipko was already up and running by then. So it was what historians call an invented tradition, right? But of course, you're right about, the forest satyagrahas of the Gandhian period, the the Munshi Satyagraha, on which the late Rajendra Bora, whom some of you might know, wrote an excellent book, right, in Marathi, and then it was my great privilege to have it rendered in English too. So they were the early critiques, but I think in many ways Chipko, because it was, it was like so emotive, symbolically so important, women and men, unlettered, and the spectacular act of threatening to hug the tree. In fact, another myth also, they actually never hugged the trees. They just threatened, right? And then how that, and in the Himalaya, in the waters of the Ganga. So I agree that, sometimes these things become frozen, elevated to a very large symbolic status. And they are pioneers before them and so on. Yeah.
And maybe along the same vein, I think.
But I think it's also that the personal encounters. So your meeting Sundarlal ji.
Yeah.
My meeting Chandi Prasad ji. I think for many people, Anil Agarwal meeting Chandi Prasad ji. I think that all of that, I think, often had that kind of, it gave it that, it's,
Yeah, but I think, and probably not enough has been written about, or some has been, but not enough about, say, people like Birsa Munda and others who kind of also, at least for some of us, the Adivasi struggles.
I would not call it environmentalism. That was defense of community rights.
Yes, but also forest.
Unlike these thinkers, because I think these people have that, people like the leaders of those movements against the expropriation of forests by the state, colonial state, were not really, they were just, their whole energies were in mobilizing people to resist exploitation and expropriation.
Sure.
But so in a sense, I would call them, whether you see them as, in a sense, yes, they anticipate some of the later struggles, but yeah.
So I think final point, and then we'll turn it to the audience also. At some point, I think you say that environmentalism, and you quoted, I think, John McNeill, the environmentalism defined as the view that humankind ought to seek peaceful coexistence with, rather than mastery over nature, right? And you say it's basically maybe 200, 250 years old in that sense. Anything before that is, the word, to use your word, anachronistic. You've quoted how religions can be one way or the other, which I agree with. But to my mind, I think, and if you see also what you've written about Elwin, is that especially Adivasi traditions, which are hundreds, maybe thousands of years old, right? And which have also inspired a lot of this. To my mind, environmentalism in that sense, especially if you're thinking of this quote from McNeill, the fact that, for instance, Adivasi communities restrain themselves in terms of, say, how much hunting they do, when they hunt, etc., or what they take from the forest kind of thing, which is very old. It seems to me, therefore, that environmentalism in that sense is actually much older, no, than just 200 to 250.
But I would qualify it in this way. That is based on deep local understanding of your local environment. But it's what industrialization, globalization, and the use of fossil fuels do is open up the possibility of destruction at a global level. And it's only then we can conceive of that the fact that the human race, you see, if there's an Adivasi community that overhunts a particular species, they learn. And maybe they move on to the next forest, but they don't know what's happening in the next valley or the next watershed. Whereas the idea that this could be a planetary crisis really dates to industrialization, large-scale urbanization, and colonialism. So it's the 19th century really is when you have, say, whether it's Tagore here or John Muir in America or Humboldt in Germany, this sense that human beings have to, and it's even then it's a minority understanding, it's a dissenting understanding, because the majority dominant understanding among intellectuals and not just among governments but among intellectuals is human beings can master, conquer, tame, control, subdue nature. I'm not sure, but I don't mention it in this book, but I mentioned elsewhere. There's an extraordinary quote of Trotsky, who's supposed to be, the most learned Marxist intellectual, about how human beings will control, once the revolution happens, how we'll control, subdue, dominate. We'll make rivers flow differently, we'll dig through mountains, we will change. I mean, so that so even then it's a dissenting, even today in India it's a dissenting understanding. It's a marginal, dissenting, oppositional understanding, and which you and I will agree is a pity. I mean, it should be more than that. It should be more widely shared. But local, conservation and prudent practices at the local level, of course, existed among many communities.
But also cosmovisions. I mean, the cosmovisions, it was not just the practices, it's also of the Adivasis. I'm not talking about mainstream religions.
I'm slightly skeptical of, how much was that, how could the vision of Australian Aboriginal, can it be transferred to an Adivasi in Chhattisgarh or to a,
I'm not saying that they're global. I'm just saying that in terms of environmentalism, I think...
they had some sense of awe, mystery, humility. I agree, which modern man conspicuously lacks.
Okay, great, thanks.